Ronaldo never loses a chance to practice his card tricks, even when he's talking over a new act with his wife. She's his assistant in the acts that they play at conventions and fairs and nightclubs. They're not big time yet, but Ronaldo thinks they can make it big with his new version of mind reading.
Listen, I have thought about this, and I want absolutely nothing to do with it. You don't know anything about this ESP.
Yes, I do. I've done enough reading to know the jargon. Who knows more?
I don't know. Why can't you just go back to using the crystal ball?
Because ESP is scientific.
Scientific? Your ESP is nothing but a bunch of old newspaper clippings that you read about Mrs. Brattle and the talks you've had with her gardener.
But that's enough.
He was such a lox.
Look, as soon as I'm finished with the rabbit trick, I'll take off my cape and toss it to you. Then the turban, the wand, you walk off.
That I like.
And I'm alone on the stage with just one spot overhead, and I say, ladies and gentlemen, may I have your complete, undivided attention and absolute silence for my next revelation. Magic is fun, but I've got something that is no trick. I have been blessed with the powers of ESP.
BS. Then you're going to pick out Mrs. Brattle at random from the audience. Then you'll go all mystical and say that you know where she came from.
Yeah, something like that.
That's nothing but a cheap con.
Oh, and the rabbit out of the hat, that's not a con.
But people know that that's a trick.
Zena, if the old lady believes me, she'll ask for private sessions that she'll pay for. Then she'll tell her friends, and they'll pay. And we won't have to be on the road all the time. And maybe, just maybe, we'll get on the Tonight Show.
Oh, Herschel, the Tonight Show?
How many times have I told you, don't call me Herschel when we're at the theater?
I'm sorry, Ronaldo. Oh, the Tonight Show? Do you think they're... Like, come on, that is crazy. Forget it.
And pass up our chance to make it big? How do you know I don't have ESP? How do you know? I see that southern plantation with a lot more detail than in the clippings. Zena, I really feel it. I'm convinced that I really do have ESP.
And I really am Eleanor Roosevelt.
Oh, Zena, you don't understand. Don't you see what this can mean? We will be through with all of these one-night stands.
This isn't a trick, is it?
Oh, no.
Oh, okay.
Okay, now here's how we'll do it. I'll take the tapes and I'll...
The great Ronaldo is expert at card tricks and any visual deception where the hand is quicker than the eye. He also can seem to read minds and see the future in a crystal ball. But his new trick is a deception based on his hazy notions of extrasensory perception, ESP. Ronaldo knows very little about ESP, and he's counting on the fact that few people know much more. Researchers in psychology are still only exploring the possibility that it exists. ESP, if it exists, is not a trick, but possibly a form of perception. And perception is a mental process, the process which gives us our mind's eye view of the world and our life upon it. Our perception of the world is a mental picture that the brain constructs from what the senses report to it. This means it's an incomplete picture, as when the hand is quicker than the eye. Often our senses don't respond to all nature's forces. For example, we can't hear radio waves, or see ultraviolet light, or smell the scent of a moth. By and large, however, we do build a pretty accurate image, so far as it goes. And the way the brain builds the image into perception is a fascinating process. Now, take sight, for instance. Your brain can tell that I'm pointing this bayonet at your face, at your feet, to your left, or to your right. The size and shape of the bayonet do not change. They only appear to change. It's your brain that interprets what you see. Now, here the sword overlaps my body, so you know it's in front of me. And when it looks like a thin wedge, you know it's pointing directly at you because that's the only position in which a long, flat shaft can seem like a short, thin sliver. This demonstrates the principles of perception in our everyday life. Here you see a simple line drawing. But what does your mind perceive? A vase, or two faces looking at each other. These same principles work for the other senses too. Someone mentions your name at a party and it leaps from a sea of mumblings into your mind. You perceive the aroma of Mom's cooking, even over 1,000 other odors. But the point is, the mind adds all these perceptions into a total, into a mental model of the world. It seems so real that we mistake it for reality. But we shouldn't forget that perception is not reality. It's a product of the brain, and the brain can be misled. Perception can be tricked. Here's a trick for verbal perception. Quickly repeat the word 0 10 times. 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, zeros. Do you start hearing two different words? Zero and Rosie? Most spectacular tricks are visual. These dots, for instance, are clearly a dancing couple to us. And yet, they are really no more than a few points of light moving on a flat screen, a television image. This visual trick works because we assume that someone walking toward us will seem to grow in size. But the dots are not a person, or even an object at all. They're an illusion. Actual perception looks similar. But all perception is affected by your physiological state, motives, expectations, and your age, sex, and experience. Expose us to a sudden grim event like this armed robbery, and perceptual differences stand out.
Get away. Give me your money. Come on, will you?
I think he had a gun. Yes, he had a knife. I saw that.
I think he had a gun.
I couldn't tell whether he was carrying a weapon or not.
No, it was a knife. A very definite knife. I know he was holding a knife.
But differences in perceptions are affected by more than background needs or expectations. Some people are simply more sensitive than others. Their thresholds of perception are lower than normal. Others have higher thresholds. A threshold is simply the halfway point between two places or states of being. At a threshold speed of, say, 200 miles per hour, a jetliner leaves the ground. However, conditions vary from day to day, so the aircraft will not always leave ground at precisely 200 miles per hour. As a matter of fact, it lifts off at 200 miles per hour only a small percentage of the time. Scientists deal with this fact by averaging the takeoff speed, which they then call the threshold. There are such thresholds here, inside the human ear. The process of hearing involves three different thresholds. The first is called the sensory threshold. In the ear, only sounds with enough force can trigger the auditory nerve impulses. This sends an impulse to the lower centers of the brain. It doesn't take much to cross the sensory threshold. The human eardrum has only to move a distance the diameter of a hydrogen atom in order to trigger some of the auditory nerves. A low threshold indeed. Not just hearing, but all senses have low sensory thresholds. So low, in fact, that an avalanche of impulses constantly pours into the brain's lower subconscious centers. They would flood our conscious minds if we had to deal with them all. So the lower centers block off the impulses and admit just a few of the most important to the brain's higher centers. They have crossed our perceptual threshold and become conscious perceptions. The final threshold in the process of perception is called the action threshold. The point at which a perception grows so insistent that it drives us to action. But these thresholds play no part in what is known as ESP, which actually means perception without normal sensory input. Ronaldo, the magician, didn't know this, and his act flopped. Oh, the performance was slick, but as it turned out, Mrs. Brattle did know something about ESP, and she was a little suspicious at the speed with which Ronaldo picked her out of the audience as the lady whose childhood home he saw so clearly in his mind. So later, she asked him which of his senses he found most effective in ESP. And he said, all of them, all my senses. So Mrs. Brattle knew that he was a phony, and he felt it wise to leave town and do straight magic for his next engagement. Ronaldo possibly had heard something or other about subliminal perception. The term subliminal comes from the Latin. Sub means below or beneath, and limen means threshold. It's possible for the mind to form perception from stimuli below the level of sensory perception.
We'll get lucky some year. Oh, honey, I'm sorry.
There's a related process that is more familiar. It's called discrimination without awareness and affects us every day. It has to do with attention. We've all had the experience of shutting things out of mind, but continuing to do our daily chores. This means we're reacting to perceptions which should be conscious. They're stimuli above the thresholds of perception, but we're not conscious of them because our attention is somewhere else. When we learn a new skill, for example, we usually need to focus all our attention on each unfamiliar step of the process. Remember when you first learned to drive a car? It took every bit of concentration to keep your foot just so on the gas pedal and your eyes on the road ahead. And at the same time, be ready to switch your foot to the brake, your hand to the horn if necessary. But after you're an experienced driver, you may start off for work or school some morning and arrive there without remembering anything about the trip since you started the car. We grow so accustomed to driving that the simple motions become automatic. That's discrimination without awareness.
Spring skiing conditions were excellent throughout the area this past weekend.
While your conscious attention wanders, your lower brain centers and right cerebral cortex take over the driving. Your conscious attention takes a vacation. It may take a near miss to bring you back to reality. Subliminal perception is different from discrimination without awareness. Subliminal perception is the phenomenon of sensing stimuli which fall beneath the thresholds of perception. Subliminal perceptions are never conscious. In fact, discovering the process came accidentally. Over 100 years ago, a scientist ran a series of tests in which he placed 2 electrodes on his patient's skin. He moved the probes closer together at each touch until the subjects couldn't tell if we were using one or two probes. However, if he made them guess one probe or two, they often guessed correctly. So much more often, in fact, that chance alone couldn't account for it. It seemed that some sort of perception were actually occurring, even if the patients weren't conscious of it. We can get some feel for events beneath thresholds of perception by watching the moving dots. You see none now. Here are 1 second exposures. Half-second exposures. At exposures of 1/2 second, the dots are above perceptual thresholds. Here's 1/4 second. Even exposures of 1/4 second give us no problems in perceiving. And if we were flashing them subliminally now, you might feel that you were still able to sense them. And there is evidence that hearing, too, has subliminal perceptions. Many stores feature soft music for their shoppers. And some store owners use a device which adds a subliminal moral message to prevent shoplifting. Does it work? Well, inventors of the device claim to have saved one store $500,000 in a 10-month period. But this has not been verified scientifically. Advertisers have also tried subliminal perceptions. Years ago, they flashed product and food names at subliminal rates on the screen during movies. But it didn't seem to have worked very well. Shoppers did not seem to change buying habits. As a general rule, it appears that the weaker a stimulus, and subliminal stimuli are exceedingly weak, the weaker its effect on our minds. It seems to make little difference whether we're young and impulsive or more mature. Subliminal perception has not been proven to change buying habits, and yet fears of mind control exist. Though the lie detector or polygraph does not measure subliminal perception, its use has probably focused fears of mind control as much as any other piece of modern equipment.
Was it a diamond ring? Diamond ring. Was it a camera? Camera.
It's ironic that the lie detector has helped us discover the brain's ability to resist some kinds of subliminal perceptions. It turns out that certain words carry an emotional load. They're taboo, at least to some people. When we present them with these loaded words in polygraph tests, their minds react, and the polygraph jumps. A psychologist used this to advantage in research on subliminal perception. With this device, words or figures could be flashed at subjects. Most subjects were older than the little girl here, old enough to get an emotional charge, positive or negative, out of taboo items. The findings were surprising. Many of the taboo words took longer to gain recognition than acceptable ones. The brain seemed to be raising the threshold of perception. This response was named perceptual defense. We know from experiments with split-brain patients that usually it's the right hemisphere that recognizes patterns, pictures, and in a subliminal way, even words, before the left hemisphere produces the experience of consciousness. It may be that somewhere in the brain, a censoring process resists the X-rated matter, which keeps it from conscious view. On the other hand, the opposite process can occur. The sensor in the brain can yield to temptation, and perceptual thresholds drop. This is called perceptual vigilance. Study of subliminal responses is difficult. There's little to grasp experimentally. But research leads to the inevitable question: are there senses we do not consciously perceive? And ultimately, are senses necessary at all? Is there extrasensory perception? If so, what kind? Is it the ability to read someone's mind? Or the ability to perceive objects without normal sensory stimulation? Or to predict future events? Or control matter with mind? We want to believe that man has the power of mind over matter, but we aren't convinced. This is the famous psychic Uri Geller, bending spoons, apparently with more mental effort than physical. But is this true power of mind? Or is it a trick of the hand, such as this magician illustrates, and Ronaldo used so skillfully? One magician has been able to repeat all Uri Geller's feats by using sleight of hand. We just don't know about extrasensory perception, but research on birds brings a fascinating look to the problem. For years, we've wondered how birds navigate, at night or by day, through fog, rain, and wind, with nothing to guide them. Nothing, that is, to us. And yet, they come home. But in 1979 came the discovery that pigeons have a small group of magnetized crystals behind each ear. Apparently, this works like a tiny compass. If so, pigeons have an extra sense. But it's still a sense. There's nothing extrasensory about it. Do we have extra senses too? In this experiment, a researcher is trying to find out. He is one of many parapsychologists who say they have evidence of extra sense. He claims to project his conscious mind out from his body and over the shelf suspended from the ceiling. When he feels he's suspended, he draws what he thinks he sees on the shelf from his transported point of view. And he draws what we actually see on the shelf.
Okay, I'm finished.
The problem is that in spite of sophisticated equipment, experiments like this are almost impossible to repeat, as are these we're seeing now. Subjects perform only under special conditions, and often only with special experimenters. Furthermore, according to many parapsychologists, you must believe in ESP in order to study it. They claim that scientists who don't believe in psychic phenomena actually suppress happenings under experimental conditions. But having to believe in what you're trying to find out goes against the very nature of good science, because you then try to prove yourself right, whether you are or not. Good science attempts merely to describe and to explain what exists, not what you would like to exist. Otherwise, you can start bending the facts, like Mr. Geller's spoons. Scientists like these, who deal with harder facts, expect their findings to be questioned and checked by others. They also don't accept findings from only one selected group. Scientific methods include checking experimental findings with those from randomly selected groups, known as control groups. For scientists, that which cannot be verified through scientific method cannot be accepted. But what about those of us who are not trained scientists? We're asked to believe many claims, some of them said to be scientific. We're told that this product, that diet, this or that budget plan really works. How do we judge their validity? We can apply some of the same criteria, or at least develop a healthy skepticism of unverified claims. We can keep open minds about many things, including extrasensory perception, always remembering that we have the privilege of saying, prove it.